Hey, how you doing? It's Clayton here from howtodrawcomics.net and welcome to today's video. In this demonstration, you're going to see me working on a cover for a comic book project that me and my brother Korey Button have been working on called KOZOR. Now, this will ultimately be a double-page wrap-around cover featuring artwork on both the front and the back of the comic book. And this here that you can see me working on right now is me starting on the front. And what we're going to have is the main character in issue 1 of KOZOR, Chief Baron, featured over to the left of the canvas, and you can see that he's taking up quite a bit of space. The first thing that I've dropped down onto the page is a very, very loose representation of his overall figure that captures his pose and roughly how much space he's going to take up within the scene. And it's really important to know that because what it allows me to do is fit around this composition the additional background elements that I'd like to include on the front cover, such as the villain of the book, Magator, which you can see me placing in a very loose sketch for again here, just behind and to the right of Chief Baron. And this guy is a very scary looking dude. He's supposed to be this malevolent demon that essentially infests the mind of Chief Baron throughout the story and slowly but surely manipulates him into essentially doing his bidding, turning him into some kind of pawn. For what means and to what ends, we're not really sure just yet, but it's not going to look good for Chief Baron. His fate is certainly hanging in the balance, and whether or not he'll be able to make it out in one piece is yet to be seen. Korey both wrote and illustrate the original version of the first issue of KOZOR. Never really saw the light of day, unfortunately, even though it was pretty much a complete comic book in and of itself. But it never went to print. We never managed to get it out there. And so we have recently launched a crowdfunding campaign to make that happen so that we can share KOZOR with the rest of the world. I'm going to even go through and essentially remaster all of the artwork and all of the colors and edit some of the dialogue throughout the book as well as this cover here that you can see me working on. So it's a very exciting time for us. This will be the first comic book project that we've ever attempted to crowdfund, so we'll see how it goes. But back to the cover here. In the bottom of this page, you can see that I've created another really loose sketch of a guy that's kind of sitting on this crystal throne with these two other female figures surrounding him. Now this is in fact KOZOR. That's the character of KOZOR right there. He doesn't make a huge appearance within the book. He's kind of featured in passing within the first few pages, but it's the thing is, with KOZOR, the comic book series, it's not just about him, and he will come into it in a much larger capacity later on, but for now, it's mostly about the characters within this world. Think Game of Thrones, Lord of the Rings. It's not necessarily about any one character in particular. It's kind of about all of them, all of the characters featured within the story and the individual parts that they play within the whole. Now, over to the left-hand side of the canvas now, you can see that I've extended it outward to create a wider width in order to both feature the front and the back cover so that when we fold it, we'll be able to have all the artwork that we want to show on the front and back in the right place, and that will be able to fit it all in there. And so it looks kind of strange at this point, And a little bit confusing, of course, because we're not able to hold the comic book within our hands and actually see how the front is going to look and how the back will look, and just kind of understanding and comprehending this wraparound cover in book form. But it will hopefully work out. There's never any guarantees, so a lot of the time you've just got to kind of wait and see as to whether or not things are going to pan out in the way in which you expect them to. But later on you will see that I create another layer that essentially fills half of the canvas with black so that I can see what the front looks like on its own and what the back looks like on its own. And in fact, that's the reason as to why I started this piece out in the way that I did. I wanted to make sure that whatever was going to be featured on the front of this KOZOR cover was going to look good on its own, even though it was ultimately going to blend into the back. And so this is a bit of a tricky composition because I've got to get somewhat surreal here in the way in which I blend these two scenes together. And in fact, the scene that you're looking at as a whole takes place within the first few pages of the first issue of KOZOR. It's a nightmare scene that unfolds within Chief Baron's dream, right? So he's passed out, he's having this nightmare, and he sees his daughter kneeling down on the side of the road underneath this tree. And as nightmares tend to go, she turns toward Chief Baron, and her face is kind of like monstrous and disfigured. It's quite a disturbing scene. Korey is a brilliant writer of horror, I must admit. It was quite a wonderful thing to be able to go through and read KOZOR for the first time without actually expecting to see what it had to offer. But I was pleasantly surprised because if you've been watching the channel for a little while, you probably already know that I'm a huge fan of horror myself, and so KOZOR was a comic book that was right up my alley, and it was really cool to see Korey's ideas composed on the page into this narrative that was unfolding throughout the book. It was really cool, and Korey could very well be the one to thank for my own comic book ambitions and wanting to bite the bullet this year and go out there on my own and write and illustrate my own comic book, which of course is Renegade Alpha. However, that's coming out much later than the first issue of KOZOR Remastered will be. So on the back of the cover, you can see that I've dropped in a few shadows onto the close-up shot of Chief Baron's head, and I've actually articulated it a fair bit more than I had on the front. However, that's exactly what I'm doing now. I flipped the canvas around, and I'm starting to add in the details. This is somewhat of the design phase of my comic book illustration process. This is where I start to define what the armor Chief Baron is wearing will look like. And on an even more basic level, I'm also thinking about his anatomy. How is that going to fit around this very basic preliminary figure that I've done up to define his pose and where he's going to be situated on the page. The anatomy makes sure, at least for me, in my eyes, that the pose does in fact work, because the muscles kind of fill in the details a little bit more there for me. It shows me visually some of the functionality of that pose. And if I can see how the muscles are fitting together over the top of the figure, then I can tell whether or not the body is moving properly, moving correctly, based upon the way in which those muscles are composed, how they're stretching. And once I've got that information down, I'm able to make the right calls a little easier. And that's very much what drawing involves, is just getting things down onto the page and then reworking what needs to be reworked based upon that additional information you've incorporated into the composition. that's just the way it goes, at least for me. I rarely have a 100% solid idea of exactly how things are going to go within my comic book illustrations. I can predict it, of course, and usually I have a vague idea, but you just never know what's going to look good, what's going to work, what's not going to work, and so you've got to be prepared to make changes as you progress through the creation of your artwork. Who knows? Every artist works in a very different way, and my way may not be the only way. There might be artists out there who just have this super clear understanding of exactly how things are going to go for them, and they put pencil to paper, and that's exactly what happens. It comes out in the completed form that they expected it to be in, and that's really amazing for them. Unfortunately, it doesn't work for me in the same way. I struggle a lot of the time, and I wish that wasn't the case. But you know what? What matters for me is that the final outcome is going to be something that I'm satisfied with. And as long as I can get there, that's all that matters to me. I don't care how the process unfolds. Sure, I will try to enjoy the journey as much as I possibly can along the way, but I can't promise that I'm going to be able to keep up my motivation a lot of the time. I can't promise that everything's going to turn out perfectly. I can only ever do my best. And I think that if you're an artist who is just starting out, or you've been doing this for a long time like I have, then that's something worth keeping in mind. It's an attitude that really helps me out, is just easing up on myself a little bit and saying, hey, you know what? Things aren't going to go perfectly here, but that doesn't matter. That's not going to stop you from creating a great piece of artwork at the end of this. Just keep on going, make the necessary corrections that you need to make along the way, and cross your fingers, hope for the best, and you might be surprised that it doesn't end up turning out as bad as you think it will. So I'm going through over the top of the loose sketch that I've already done once more, and I'm starting to implement over the top of Chief Baron's anatomy now the finer attributes of his costuming. So he's going to have this forearm armor, which is kind of made of wood, but then clamped together with these metal, I guess, supports. I'm not sure what they are. A lot of the time I know how to draw something, even though I don't actually know what it is. But you can see the spikes there around the circular, supports. I got to assume that that's what keeps the wood in place on that forearm armor. And you've got the lining around the top and the bottom of it as well that I've placed in, and figuring out how to bend those spikes on those rings in the foreshortened perspective that I've got them presented on is something which is very tricky to do sometimes. You really got to have a great ability to comprehend basic forms in space based upon the point of view that you're shooting the scene from. That's going to be what determines how everything is drawn up. It's going to determine the perspective. So you've got to think about that stuff, and you've got to be able to imagine it inside your mind as you're working. And then once you have got that down onto the page, you want to take an analytical approach, a critical eye, and ask yourself whether or not that actually looks like what it is you're trying to achieve with that form or with that subject matter. And if it's not, then you may need to go in and just do some erasing, do some tweaking. A lot of the time the solution isn't obvious, but as long as you keep on experimenting and you keep on moving along, you're going to be fine. Eventually you'll lay down the right line, and it'll look the way that you want it to. And my goodness, this is something that happens to me all the time, even in the later points of an illustration. And who knows, maybe it's a habit that I've developed for myself over time, and it may not be even necessarily a good habit that I've developed. Maybe if I had have been a little harder on myself and made sure that I get the right thing down onto the page the first time that I attempt to do it, then maybe I would spend less time fixing things up now. But, again, all that matters to me is that end outcome. So if I can achieve that whenever I set out to do one of these illustrations, doesn't matter how I do it, as long as it gets done, that's all that matters to me. And it does take a little bit of extra time, but hey, so be it. I'm always working on ways in which I can improve my process, optimize it, speed up as much as I can, but I am a slow artist, and I've always struggled with that. I've always fought that. I've always wanted to be quicker, but I'm starting to kind of accept my fate here and just say, hey, you know what? I'm going to take my time with this. It's going to be worth it in the end. I at least know that. The thing is, for me, it's more of a physical concern. Working for long periods of time on a complex piece like this is somewhat taxing on your hand. Your hand starts to clamp up. It starts to hurt. It starts to ache. And if you look at my hands, you can tell they are the hands of an artist after years and years of gripping the pen or the pencil or the stylus super hard. It takes a toll. So that's more what I'm thinking about. I'm not thinking about getting faster, but I am thinking about ways in which I can ease up the pressure that I'm applying to my hand, for example, and making sure that I can walk away from a piece I've been working on for hours straight without, having a hand that aches, having a hand that's red and sore, because that's just not going to help me out. That's going to stop me from drawing. I'll have to take a break for a day or two in order to get back into it if I'm going to push myself that much. So, I'm taking more breaks. I'm loosening my grip, which, funnily enough, has allowed me to be able to draw out smoother lines, especially when I'm inking. That's become very valuable. Now, we're not going to get into the final pencils in this demonstration. We're not going to get into the inking just yet, because this is really just the drafting stage. This is the first step. This is me figuring out really what the idea is that I want to go for, and then working on it a little bit, trying to figure out the nuts and bolts that are going to go into it. And then over the top of that, in the next demonstration that I put out on this cover, I'm going to tighten up those pencils, tighten up those details, really get a solid idea as to where the rendering is going to be placed, where the shadowing is going to be placed, and it's still going to be rough. It's not going to be 100% polished, but it will give me a lot of information to work with in order to confidently go in and start doing the inks. And that's a lot of planning that goes into something like this. Sometimes, and there are times where I have found it's not good to plan so much. Sometimes you can overplan things, you can overthink things, and it somehow builds up the pressure a little bit, and you become reluctant to jump in there with the inks, or you start to ink up a drawing that's, it's got a lot of details in there, but the inks don't really take on a life of their own. They don't have an energy of their own. They're kind of hanging off of and depending on the energy of the pencils. Because I think as an inker, you have to kind of go your own way. Even if you're inking your own stuff, you've got to be able to make sure that you're redrawing the piece almost in your own vision, and that same energy that was in the initial pencils is still there within your inks. And I think the only way to really capture that is to have that mindset. Know that, yes, the pencils are there as a guide, but they are not that's not the final illustration. That's not the final rendition. Your inks are the final rendition. And so, we'll get a little bit more into that. It's something that I've been struggling with a little bit inking this piece, actually, because, I did the initial draft up a few weeks ago now. So I've since worked on it, since progressed on it, but it is something that I've been thinking a lot about, exactly how far I need to take these pencil drafts before I jump onto the inking. And you can see that I made that new layer there. I filled half of the canvas with black just to make sure I had Chief Baron situated on the page, composed correctly on that front cover in a way in which made him fit well, you know. And it's very important to make sure that you show your artwork to other people, because it wasn't until I showed the cover, this wraparound cover, to both the front and the back, to Korey, my brother, and my good buddy Rob, the Replicator, who you may also be well acquainted with here on the YouTube channel, that they pointed out that Chief Baron just didn't quite look right. He didn't quite fit on the page properly. So I had to change it up, and I'm glad that I had that, you know, those extra pair of eyes to tell me what I needed to do. But that wraps up this initial demonstration for the front cover of the remastered version, the definitive edition of KOZOR No.1. We're actually going to call this book KOZOR Descent into Madness. So it's going to be a lot of fun. We've already got a bunch of sign-ups for the pre-launch of KOZOR, and I'd highly recommend you go on over to the pre-launch page yourself and join the mailing list. It's a great way to keep in touch, and I'm going to be able to let you know exactly when we end up launching the campaign. I'm going to be able to send you previews of the artwork that we're doing for it. I'm going to be able to send you links to videos just like this one so that you can check out everything that's happening with KOZOR. We want to keep you in the loop as much as possible. If you'd also like to see what other comic book projects we're working on, I highly suggest that you head on over to www.bartonbrostudios.com. We've got a mailing list there as well. It's actually the same mailing list as the pre-launch page for KOZOR. Everyone who has signed up to KOZOR will be placed onto the Barton Bros mailing list, so that's really cool. Join either one. You only have to join one, really. And you'll still get the same information, the same emails, the same updates from us, and everything that we're working on at Barton Bros Studios. So other than that, if you like more comic art tips, tricks, and tutorials, be sure to visit www.howtodrawcomics.net. You know, we're trying to make sure that we're releasing content for howtodrawcomics.net as much as we ever have before, while also at the same time giving you the latest on our comic book projects. I guess it has always kind of made sense to do that. I've been teaching people for so long how to create comic books. I guess it's about time I create my own and let you in on exactly what that process entails. Anyway, that's about it for today. Until next time, keep on creating, keep on drawing, and I'll see you in the next video.